Like and subscribe, join the Discord, the Minecraft server, and the Patreon. Now let's dive. I spent the last 3 weeks of my life digging up the real, unknown information about Jeffrey Epstein. You know him, the beloved financier and philanthropist, and his esteemed girlfriend Ghislaine Maxwell, the heiress and Redditor. And in that time, I noticed that there was a hole in the market for Epstein information, that being any reasonable proof he actually met his end by his own hand in August of 2019 in the jail cell. And from my research, there's only one conclusion from what I've uncovered. Not only did Epstein not take his own life, he never even died at all. And so that's what I've set out to do for you here today. Bring all this information together that I have gleaned from the internet and first prove that Epstein did not kill himself, and second of all, prove that he is still alive, and third of all, give some plausible theories about where he might be today. One would assume that guarding Epstein was a battalion of Navy SEALs, perhaps prepared to perish to preserve and ensure that Epstein would be forced into revealing everyone implicated in his ways, but no, we actually had the opposite. And for us, that's where this story really begins. At 6:30 a.m., Jeffrey Epstein is discovered by the 2 guards who had been posted outside of his cell named Tova Noel and Michael Thomas. And they are reason number 1 that Epstein did not kill himself. These 2 guards were so derelict in their duties and genuinely stupid that it can only be intentional. The pair were meant to check on Epstein every 15 to 30 minutes and keep a strict log of having done so, but they just decided not to do that and instead just forged the logbook and said that they made their rounds. Now, with all the extra time on their hands, what might they have been doing, you ask? They were really busy, shopping for furniture online, looking at motorcycles they could only afford if perhaps they were given a giant amount of cash, and making little refresher walks to the break room, which was the opposite direction of Epstein's cell and dozens of feet further. And for the record, these check-ins that they had to do were incredibly simple. Tova Noel and Michael Thomas were posted roughly 15 feet from Epstein's jail cell door, and all they had to do was walk over there, make sure he wasn't doing anything circumspect, and walk back. It's not like they had to check his prison wallet every 15 minutes. And even worse, the 2 were, and I can't make this up, taking simultaneous 2-hour-long naps. And conveniently, alongside this, the camera stopped working and there was no video evidence of Epstein's jail cell floor. But it's also worth noting that there's a camera inside of Epstein's cell that's never discussed, and that too just magically stopped working and we don't have the footage for it. Now, I won't get into the math of how all these cameras could stop operating at the same time, because it's not possible, but it's just one of the many reasons why Epstein certainly did not kill himself. Reason 2 Epstein did not kill himself is that the same night the guards were sleeping and shopping, the inmates were most certainly not. I presume there was a unique dynamic in the cell block, as the special housing unit where Epstein was filled with murderers, and an international pedophile being just feet away from them, well, he was very likely to have his life ended by somebody. As it's commonly known that pedophiles are the first to die in prison, and according to the most conservative statistics, they are at least twice as likely to die as any other inmate. Thus, I presume many inmates wondered who had gotten to Epstein when they began hearing shrieking and shouting in their own words from Epstein's cell the night of his alleged demise. Not to state the obvious, but you don't scream while hanging yourself in prison. It sort of defeats the purpose. On your end, I'm sure you're wondering, like I was when I read this, why weren't we told that there'd been screaming from Epstein's cell the night of his death? After all, every inmate seems to have heard it because it was that loud, and they were emphatic that this came from Epstein's cell, no one else's, and it wasn't the guards. And speaking of the guards, why didn't anyone go and check in on Epstein at this point? Certainly if there were a time to get off Wayfair and make sure the world's most high-profile criminal wasn't being murdered, would be when he's shouting and screaming from his jail cell. That would be unless you as a guard were paid off, which these 2 obviously were. Anyone can see that. Now, Cooper, you might add here, it's clear that Tova and Michael were failing in their duties. We can't deny that, but we can't just say they were paid off with no evidence. After all, these are highly trained, long-time prison guards. They wouldn't just take a bribe. Certainly the Bureau of Prisons has standards to prevent that sort of thing from happening. And here's reason 3 why Epstein did not kill himself. Firstly, Tova Noel was a new hire. That was the female guard on site that night. She was only recently progressed from training and placed into normal operations, and she was scum. She was known to be bad at her job and had taken it upon herself to physically assault one of her colleagues, which she was later sued for. Now, it's only worth laughing at because Tova said that her colleague was being racist for telling her how to do her job and helping her. And the colleague that Tova had been saying these things about was, no joke, an elderly Mexican woman who had been in the system for a number of years and had been placed in charge of Tova's training. So it was her trainer telling her what to do. While on the other hand, Michael Thomas, the other security guard, wasn't quite the pick of the litter either. After Epstein allegedly took his life, an anonymous source inside the prison reached out to a couple of news agencies and reported that one of the guards wasn't actually a Bureau of Prisons employee. And we know Tova technically was, so they must be referring to Michael Thomas. And so I did a little bit more digging, and apparently he was a temporary helper hired to keep employee and guard numbers at normal levels. That's right, Michael Thomas, based on this report, likely was not even a prison guard. He was possibly one of dozens of people on the prison floor that night who weren't thoroughly vetted and had no history of working in the Bureau of Prisons. And he's the exact kind of guy you would want to be guarding a fellow like Epstein if, say, you were trying to get him out. So of the two people tasked with guarding Epstein, not only were both of them either willfully incompetent and plain stupid, they were also the lowest possible common denominator of employee possible, and one wasn't even a real trained guard. But hey, at least justice was served, right? Tova and Michael both got acquitted on all charges, including forging prison documents, which they legitimately did but got off on because they pleaded black and told the judge that they were being used as scapegoats because of their race. Just let that one settle in for you. Reason number 4, Epstein did not kill himself. Suicide watch is one of the most regulated things an inmate can be on. The protocol is either to remove everything from the inmate's cell or put him in a special cell with nothing in it but a plastic mattress. And then you strip the inmate completely nude, and at that point a guard is placed on 24/7 watch over the inmate. You literally don't even get toilet paper in there because you could use that to choke yourself. And because it's so strenuous, it's often very difficult to get into. In fact, Epstein was evaluated more than 3 times by prison psychologists before actually getting placed on suicide watch. It's also typical for prisoners to have a sort of downshifting period from maximum watch to a lesser version of that. And the lesser version is that once they leave the nude chamber, they then go into a special section of the prison where their cell is closest to the guards, so they have immediate access. And they also typically have a less offensive cellmate with them to help ensure that if they do begin trying to kill themselves, the cellmate will stop them from doing it. And Epstein was in fact moved to the closest cell to the guards. We saw how much that helped, but Epstein was also given a very lackluster cellmate, the kind of dude that most would be afraid of. In fact, rather than getting a less violent or non-violent offender, Epstein got probably the most violent offender in there at that time, at least in his unit. His name was Nicholas Tartaglione, a former cop who murdered 4 people, and this man was Epstein's cellmate, before and after being in suicide watch. And it's critical to know this because Epstein didn't allegedly try taking his own life once, but twice, according to most resources. But I'll tell you why this is crap. On July 23rd, he was found on the floor of his cell with a strip of bedsheet around his neck. Sounds familiar. Now, this Tartaglione fellow is no joke. He's built like a fortress, a massive man. But an important connection to make is that one of these murders he conducted was on a woman in which he strangled her. And Epstein was found with a bedsheet tied around his neck within feet of a man who literally strangles people to death. Indeed, if this weren't Epstein and he weren't in prison, it's pretty clear that Tartaglione would be on trial right now for another attempted murder. But the skeptic out there will be willing to take the headlines at face value and assume these are just coincidences. And to the skeptic, I say the following. Epstein told lawyers that his cellmate, Nicholas Tartaglione, had roughed him up after being sent to suicide watch. And in addition to that, Epstein would make a very interesting remark to his lawyers and several other people within the prison. That being that he was a coward, would never try and take his own life, and he was afraid of pain. So therefore, why on earth do we have the mainstream narrative that it was Epstein trying to take his own life? Reason number 5, that Epstein did not kill himself, goes along with the above, in the sense that there are dozens of things I could point out, and this video will be an hour plus long. So to save time and get to the juicier bits later on, I'm just gonna rapid fire a few factoids at you. Number 1, on July 16th, Epstein made an unmonitored and illegal phone call from prison, presumably on an employee's phone he got permission from. Worth noting, this employee broke every single code, and yet he was never prosecuted. The phone call, despite being made in a prison with dozens of cameras watching and recording audio, has never been released. Maybe the cameras weren't working that day either. And to this day, over 6 years later, we still are not told who was on the other end of the line. Epstein eventually hung up the phone after a stern, many minutes long conversation and gave the phone back to the employee. Now, who on earth could Epstein have possibly said he was calling? Well, his mommy, of course. And apparently the guard was never given a basic facts file on Epstein, because had he been, he would have known that Epstein's mother had been dead since 2004, a full 15 years prior to this phone call. Meaning who Epstein made the call to is still completely unknown, but it definitely wasn't his mom. Another interesting fact is that Epstein reported bizarre happenings in his cell prior to his demise, including a toilet that wouldn't stop flushing and the inability to sleep. He would cover his ears and shut his eyes and curl up in a ball to try and get any shut-eye. And yet despite this, he maintained upwards of 12-hour meetings with his lawyers on a daily basis. In addition to this, another interesting report that refutes the Epstein suicide theory is that Epstein had recently purchased a radio for AM/FM transmission and a set of headphones from the prison, which several prison officials went on record as saying they believed was Epstein getting used to the idea that he was going to be here for a while. And finally, the Manhattan Metropolitan Correctional Facility where Epstein was housed was known for a major problem. That being that inmates were being delivered supplies via drone, meaning machines and possibly people could easily have gotten into Epstein without anyone noticing, as it's happened before. Now that is a fact they don't want you to know. That all being said, let's fast forward to reason 6. It's 6:33 a.m. on August 10th, and Epstein has yet to report to the guard and come for breakfast. So the guards Michael and Tova finally go in to check on Epstein, only to find him in a kneeling position with his legs just shy of touching the floor, being held up by a set of bed sheets tied to the top bar of his bunk bed. At this juncture, it doesn't take Sherlock Holmes to surmise that Epstein is obviously long dead. And it's not like these were new guards. They were well aware that they hadn't checked in on him in many hours and that there was no chance to revive Epstein. Therefore, the expectation at this point would be to immediately get doctors and medical examiners here and ensure that absolutely nothing can disrupt the crime scene and that no one tampers with the evidence. But the guards don't do this. According to his testimony, Michael Thomas bursts into the 86.4 square foot cell and cuts Epstein down from where he is held aloft. He then proceeds to attempt resuscitating the lifeless husk, shouting, "Breathe, Epstein, breathe," followed up with, "We're going to be in so much trouble." Certainly Thomas was correct. He should have been in so much trouble. And it's worth noting, this body is so dead at this point, he has the same chance of breathing life into it as he does my stuffed horse. And based on Michael Thomas's words and own account, he was well aware of that. He was just doing this to cover his butt. The two prison guards then proceed to use a defibrillator on Epstein, all the while continuing to disturb the crime scene. Completely destroyed all available evidence in the cell. If there were any other DNA present at one point in this room, it certainly isn't there any longer. Everything in the cell is manhandled, covered in their DNA, and thrown around. Even Epstein's mattress ends up on the floor, which makes zero sense. At this juncture, it's surpassed the point where stupidity is no longer an acceptable excuse. These two were not only derelict in their duties, they then entered a crime scene and destroyed all of the evidence. Eventually, the medical professionals on site got wind of what happened to Epstein and come to remove the body and photograph the evidence. Once again, breaking protocol though, because they should have left the body in the cell and then taken photos as the scene stood, which to my knowledge, and based on all the photos online that I could find, did not happen. They removed his body and then took photos of what was left inside. So now we're left with a completely unusable crime scene, two further guilty guards, and questionable medical examiners who didn't even take the right kind of photos. Which leads us into reason number 7 why Epstein did not kill himself. After the crime scene was destroyed, photos were taken, but barely a handful it looks like. I would imagine you'd be taking hundreds, maybe even thousands of photographs at this point, just to make sure that you cover all of your bases, where to your knowledge, Earth's most depraved criminal just hanged himself. But they don't do this. Instead, we get these out of focus, strangely angled photos showing us seemingly intentionally, in my opinion, absolutely nothing of value. I went to dinner with my family a couple days ago and I took better and more accurate photographs of what I ate than what they did of Epstein's crime scene. But unintentionally, this photographer caught something he probably wasn't supposed to. The discerning eye, upon a second glance, will notice some pretty groundbreaking piece of evidence that even Tova and Michael Thomas couldn't have missed. First is the alleged noose, which was made either from bed sheets or bits of clothing. The facts are a bit murky there. In either case, the material given to the prisoners for clothing and sheets is designed in a manner to prevent just this Epstein situation from happening. Also, as far as I can tell online, the color of uniform for the Manhattan Metropolitan Correctional Center is blue, not orange. At least that's what all the MCC prisoners I could find online were depicted as wearing, but hey, I mean, that's just a bit odd to me. But it could be that they changed uniform colors by the time Epstein got there. I think that's doubtful, but I'll grant the skeptic the benefit of the doubt there. What, however, is even stranger is that if we refer to Michael Thomas's own testimony, he states that he had noticed Epstein dangling from the top of his bed. And so he runs in, pulls out a blade, and cuts Epstein down. But wait a minute there, buddy. There is not a single sign of this fabric having been cut with a knife. Moreover, the end of the material is hemmed, meaning that most certainly it was never cut. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, it is certainly not the noose that Epstein used on himself, most obviously because Epstein did not kill himself. Reason number 8, Epstein did not kill himself. I'm going to advocate for the other side here. If I were to lobotomize myself right this second and believe that Epstein, the man who, as we discussed in the Zorro Ranch video, was obsessed with living forever to the point of having laboratories and female egg farms under his home, actually killed himself, then there are even more questions that we must answer. For instance, why would he choose the most impossible method for taking his own life? A method that would only cause him pain, not death, and would likely get him thrown in the nude suicide watch chamber. And once again, this is the guy who made a point of telling everyone around him that he was a coward who hated pain. The answer is simply that he wouldn't. He would never take the slowest, most painful, and most unlikely way of taking his life. Instead, he would choose a much more guaranteed method for ending his life. Something sturdy and reliable and built Ford tough, my bad, not an ad read right now. You know, like a large swath of thick plastic tubing. Or, you know, if I had my pick of the litter, I might choose a strong, black, unbreakable power cord. Now, obviously, Epstein didn't have his pick of the litter and couldn't have chosen either of these, so why are you telling me this, Cooper? Well, because Epstein actually could have chosen either of these things instead of the bed sheets. And that's because Epstein had sleep apnea. What a weird diversion, Cooper. I know. Why do I care? Just trust me here. I have a thing. My father also has sleep apnea, and with it comes a very large, loud machine with this strap that goes over your face and like sucks into your nose. It's really weird looking. And then that attaches to a length of thick plastic tubing that then goes into a machine, typically a big black box, that forces you to breathe and is powered by typically a long black cable which plugs into any wall within several feet. Sleep apnea is really crucial for some people because at certain points you can stop breathing for seconds or minutes on end, which obvious problems when you stop breathing, you can die. And in spite of that, I still make fun of my dad, but that's a side point. But taking my dad out of the story, Epstein is sitting in a room with his sleep apnea machine. This sleep apnea machine was not regulated for prisons at all. You can see it in the picture. It has several feet of this thick plastic tubing and then several feet of black cable plugging into the wall. So you'd actually have to be an idiot not to use that instead. And if there's one thing Epstein is not, he's most certainly not an idiot. Makes you wonder then why the media never told you that little bit of information, did it? Because all you had to do was look at a photo. Reason number 9. Now at this juncture, I am sure that in no way you believe Epstein took his own life. If you do, I would like to sell you some knives, and if you get 3 of your friends to join, I'll make you rich. So what else we can agree on is that I haven't quite proven that Epstein isn't dead. Fair, so let's move our attention to the photos of his body after it's taken away from the prison. The first thing you may notice is that none of these autopsy photos look like Epstein. And it's convenient that there are no photos that are direct on angles of his face, which means we can't run any facial recognition software or clearly discern if it's him or not. That being said, we can disprove this being Epstein's body well before the autopsy photos. There is a photo that reveals more to us than any direct on shot of his face could. And it's this skeezy little angle we get of Epstein's ear, or very clearly not Epstein's ear because they don't even remotely match one another. So unless Epstein got new ears while in prison, this is not his body, which leaves us to wonder whose it is then. I've seen and read many theories, including a body double for who this could be, which is possible considering Epstein's countless millions of dollars he poured into his foray into human cloning, which, no joke, check out the Zorro Ranch video if you haven't seen that. My personal theory though is that this body looks a ton like the brother of Hillary Clinton named Tony Rodham, who died just a handful of weeks prior to Epstein. And here's a photo of what he looks like. And no, I'm not lying to you, the man on screen is not Jeffrey Epstein. That's actually Hillary's brother, and you are not mistaken thinking that they could practically be twins. In fact, here's a side profile of him playing golf with Bill Clinton. The resemblance is uncanny. And the ears too, based on what I've seen, seem to show a lot of similarities with that of the body on the gurney, but it's hard to tell because photos of Tony are not exactly bountiful. It is interesting though that Tony's nose most certainly has more of a hooked shape like the body on the gurney, which Epstein's most certainly does not. However, that is not nearly the only thing about this photo that makes it so suspicious, not by a long shot. Indeed, the more compelling argument is about the photo itself, and more specifically, who took it. Let's pause and ask ourselves. No one at this point outside of a few prison staff knows Epstein's dead, supposedly, and no one has spoken about the matter outside of the prison system. So how then did a photographer manage to be at the exact right place at the exact right moment to get a photo of the now deceased, allegedly world's most high-profile criminal ever in the split second he's taken from the ambulance into the hospital? How? I mean, 1,000 things would have had to go correct. He would have had to know which prison Epstein was coming from. He would have had to have known when they were going to take him out. He had to have known that he had died. He had to have known which hospital they were going to take Epstein to, and at what time. There were so many things that just make the chances of this happening 0. And no, there wasn't a tip-off either. It wasn't leaked to the press, and no one was made aware that Epstein was going to be there. And this is the only photographer who shows up to see Epstein. So I can't believe that, and therefore I decided to look into who this photographer is. After all, he does seem to have the most fortunate timing ever and the best connections ever. He must have an illustrious career, correct? And you'd be incorrect because he doesn't actually exist. The name of this photographer is William Farrington, who happens to share the same last name and likeness of the infamous photographer Roger Farrington. Roger was famous for working with the CIA in the 1970s and being one of those guys who always got the exclusive shots of the most atrocious criminals. And the Epstein photos are nowhere near the first time he got an extremely well-timed photo, not even by a long shot. One example is he was one of the last people to get photos of John Lennon before his likely government-ended demise in the 1980s. Roger Farrington was also known for his special connections to the Boston Mafia in the 1970s. Roger Farrington was also a very close friend of the Clinton family and took many of their photos, and also had top secret security clearance. Just let that one settle in for a second. And Roger Farrington has also photographed the wealthy, powerful, and celebrities, and his list of employers is just about the exact same as Epstein's Black Book. So I don't know about you, but that seems like a connection to me. And this William Farrington, despite taking one of the most important series of photos ever, that being Epstein's body being rolled out of the ambulance, has no desire to take credit for it. Indeed, outside of the watermark with his brand name on it, you really won't find him talking about it anywhere. Thus, when an investigator managed to find his phone number and call him, he got a very strange response that he wasn't expecting, considering how important this photograph was. And here it is for you now.
Hello?
Hi, is this Bill Farrington?
Who's calling?
My name's Robbie Walters. I'm a freelance writer from upstate New York.
What's going on?
I wanted to see if you had like a minute or so to talk about that Epstein photo you took on Saturday.
I don't really care to talk about it.
Well, it's like a worldwide photo now. It's like probably the photo of the year. I just was,
I don't think so. I think that's not right. Thanks, Robbie. I appreciate your time.
Okay. All
Take care.
right, bye.
Combine everything I've told you with this recording and the fact that there's zero social media presence for Will online, except for LinkedIn with no posts and a few followers. There's really no reason to believe this guy is anything other than Roger Farrington, using another name. And I might add that it is very convenient William also works for the New York Post, which is owned by a man named Rupert Murdoch, another vile fellow and friend of Epstein and Ghislaine's. And once again, I'm sure that's just a coincidence, but I doubt that this reason number 10 is, because if we were to look into Rupert Murdoch, we're going to notice some interesting things. His history of faking photographs does not begin with Epstein's. So let's switch to another photograph, that being Ghislaine's infamous In-N-Out Burger photo shoot. For context, 2 days after Epstein perished, allegedly, Ghislaine Maxwell was caught out at random at an In-N-Out Burger just reading a book and eating some munchies. This was the first public appearance of Ghislaine in over 3 years, and understandably everyone was a bit shocked to just see her there, sitting and eating. After all, this is the demon spawn and accomplice of Jeffrey Epstein, the international pedophile trafficker murderer, and she's just sitting there munching on her meal and reading a book. What gives? And there's a lot to unravel here, so let's run it from the top to the bottom. First of all, the book Ghislaine is reading is entitled The Book of Honor, The Secret Lives and Deaths of CIA Operatives, which is a little on the nose considering her father Robert Maxwell, herself, and Epstein were all intelligence assets. But that is by no means the strangest thing in this photo. Expanding into the photo itself, there are some things that are clearly off. According to the story, the photographer was a random passerby who noticed Ghislaine and asked if she was actually Ghislaine Maxwell, and then took the photo. Except that's definitely a lie. Firstly, there are 2 drinks, 2 phones, and 2 trays of food, as well as an ID badge sitting on the table. Ghislaine is clearly not alone, as the whole news media was telling us. Secondly, reviewing the metadata for the photo shows that it wasn't taken on some random phone camera, but a high-quality photography camera, which is convenient. Someone just had that with them while at In-N-Out Burger. Thirdly, the copyright for the image is owned by a company named Meadowgate Media, and a basic search for business filings shows us that Meadowgate Media has 5 directors or officers, and the agent for the company, who filed the paperwork, is a woman named Leah Staphian. And Leah, as we are told, is not some random passerby, but actually the Maxwell family lawyer, and was with Ghislaine all the way through her show trial. The dog in the In-N-Out image is not Ghislaine's dog, as I imagine she eats puppy souls for breakfast, but is actually her lawyer Leah Staphian's dog, and you can see that on her archived social media profiles from the time. Thus, the photograph was clearly staged, but to really bring it home, Meadowgate Media is also the name of a company owned by Rupert Murdoch, the same fellow who owns the company that got the impossibly well-timed photos of Epstein being rolled out of the ambulance, or well, I shouldn't say Epstein because we all know without a doubt that's not his body, which is just another clear sign that Rupert Murdoch is involved in this and stages photos. But if you thought I was done there, no. One more detail must be added to this whole thing. The Ghislaine photo was manipulated like all get out. When you remove the mosaic blurs from the faces in the background, you would quickly notice that the blurring was premature, because these people don't even have faces. For instance, the man in the back seems to have 4 sets of eyes that pop out of his face, in addition to a completely disjointed set of cheeks that don't really match his face. And he too, despite eating alone, has 2 drinks on the table, which is weird. The woman on the left of Ghislaine has an eye that is being overgrown by a random piece of flesh on her face, and the same seems to be happening for the other 2 old men at the table. Thus, either something horrible and undefinable happened to these folks, or this photo was horribly photoshopped, making it more clear this was staged. While we're at it though, knowing old Rupert Murdoch, Epstein's buddy, likes to falsify photos, let's point out what's wrong with the Epstein ambulance photo, besides the fact the body's in Epstein's. One, the oxygenator isn't even in Epstein's mouth, you can tell by the angle. What am I saying? This whole thing is a lie. Let's not even belabor the point. No EMT ever pretends a body's alive and gives it oxygen and puts the neck in a brace. The whole thing's ridiculous. Epstein's been dead for like 6 hours at this point. This entire thing was a clever piece of propaganda. By the time Epstein made it to the ambulance, he was long dead. Unless your point is to make people think that, oh my goodness, they had rushed him to the hospital and he passed away there, and that Epstein had just taken his own life. It's clearly not what happened, and it's just ridiculous that they're trying to sell it at this point. This next section is just going to be a series of reasons why Epstein is very clearly alive. We'll try and go rapid fire because this video is already very long. The first reason I believe Epstein is not dead is simple. In 2014, 5 years before his death, Epstein masterminded the establishment of an unmonitored account that he reported to the authorities in the Virgin Islands that it would be used for establishing an international bank. In reality, this account was basically a really fancy entity that was separate from Epstein himself and would go unnoticed by almost everybody. And Epstein could run money in and out of it. Even Epstein's legal team didn't know about it until well after his alleged death. Just get this though, when Epstein supposedly dies in prison, the account has roughly $700,000 sitting in it. Within 5 months of his demise, the Epstein estate, which he sets up 2 weeks prior to his death while in prison, sends an automatic wire transfer of $15.5 million to the account. And I want to remind you, the only person who had access to this account or knew it existed and could have unilaterally made the transfer was Epstein, meaning that in December, the total amount of money in the account was roughly $16.2 million-ish. Once again, only one man is capable of this, and he's supposedly deceased. Even stranger, no one ever presses Epstein's legal team on this. The story dies right about the same time, with no major news media coverage, which is why you've never heard of it likely until right now. There was one report I was able to find with any amount of decent information in it, and the judge says about the money that there is no explanation for it, and then the lawyers for Epstein proceed to claim that the money transfer was an error, and that the money was just used to make basic payments like cable bills. First of all, is it an error, or is it for paying bills? Because one, you don't make a $15 million error, and two, you don't need $15 million to pay for your cable bill. And $16.2 million is more than enough to live off of, or in my theory, to get to another country with. And I don't want to leave out that within a few weeks of Epstein's account receiving this $15 million transfer, all the money was liquidated, and before the new year, it was gone. No one knew where it went. On that note, there is an interview from an Epstein source claiming to be a Mossad agent. The agent goes on to claim that Epstein is alive and continuing his evil ring from the deserts of Israel, where he is being protected, and that Epstein has also continued the cloning operations we uncovered previously. The Mossad agent says he, along with many of his friends, were tasked with guarding Epstein, but are disgusted. Epstein is taking children from the streets of Israel and doing unimaginable things with them. And whether you take him at his word or not is up to you, but we do know that Epstein and Ghislaine's dad and Ghislaine herself were all Mossad agents based on the last video. And there is a picture of Epstein wearing an IDF or Israeli Defense Force shirt on a private jet with another individual. And finally, former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, was one of Epstein's best friends visiting his home in New York over 30 times after Epstein was convicted of sex trafficking children. It is also known that girls would walk into Epstein's home that very same time that Ehud was visiting. And let's not forget that the government of Israel is one of the most pervasive examples of defending pedophilia. They do it for fun over there. Moving on to the third rapid fire reason Epstein is not dead, is that after doing that 30-minute Zorro Ranch video, I realized something very odd. A few years after Epstein allegedly passed away in prison, an anonymous buyer came forward and purchased the property at about a $10 million discount. And to this day, multiple years later, we've never gotten a single bit of information about who owns the property. And I do have to imagine that only one person would really be willing to buy that kind of property, considering that the entire thing is covered in cameras, and there's a kiddie strip club in the basement, and egg farms, and all sorts of other disgusting things. Which then makes me wonder why this buyer has been left anonymous, because there's only so many people in this world who have the sort of money to acquire such a property. And there's even fewer people who would know how to operate all the things inside of the property. And finally, keeping the buyer anonymous really does make me think that Epstein just reacquired the property under a different trust so that no one would be the wiser. Because after all, CNN and Fox told us he's dead, so he's dead. But sorry, that's too conspiratorial. 4, Epstein was clearly wealthier than anyone has ever been told. I've seen the numbers of his net worth go up every year from 500 million to 600 million to $1 billion to $2 billion. He clearly had a lot more money than we're aware of, and more important than money was his sway. He had connections to just about every single wealthy or powerful person or celebrity on the face of the earth, and there's no shot that he ended his life in prison. He most certainly got out. But one reason why I think that is because most of Epstein's wealth and his properties have been hidden to us. For instance, I'm assuming that you did not know, as I didn't until recently, that Little St. James, the island of infamy that comes to mind for everyone when they think of Epstein, was actually one of 2 islands he owned. He admitted to this in an interview. Little St. James is the little version of his other island, which is named the Great St. James. Little St. James is about 71 acres, and his Great St. James is 2.5 times the size of that, coming in at a whopping 161 acres. That island has never been searched, and we do know that there are buildings on it, but no one really seems to be able to get pictures of the property up close, which is just another odd addition. It's also worth noting that allegedly these islands were sold, but to an anonymous buyer, for whom we have never gotten the name for, which co-aligns with just about every other Epstein property that has been sold to date. They all have anonymous buyers who never want to come forward. At the same time as this, we have drone footage of Epstein's little island a short while after his death, and while this drone was flying around getting video of the property, he noticed that there was a couple of people hanging out there. At first, one would assume that they were just landscape workers, but upon a second glance, you notice that besides the black guy, is this really oddly familiar looking white guy with white hair. He's just hanging out on his ATV, standing there, until he notices that there's a drone above him, at which point he hides his face for a little bit and then gets into the ATV and immediately drives as fast as possible into the garage where he's never seen again. And the angle is a bit tough, but that gringo does seem to look a lot like Epstein, and it is his island, so who knows? Definitely worth thinking about, but once again, not something you find in the news media. The resemblance truly is uncanny. But above all, if there were a reason to believe Epstein did not take his own life, and that he is still alive, it would be how quickly the media tried to cover it up. From left to right, I really don't care what your politics are. Every mainstream source was afraid to follow a real lead, like the magic money transfers Epstein was receiving, and they programmed us with hundreds of articles to not question the narrative. Because if you do, you're just an idiot and you love conspiracy theories. Well, you know what? There's an international child sex trafficker blackmailing the most powerful and wealthy people on earth, getting them to kids on camera, murdering them, and stealing their eggs, and discussing how he wanted to clone himself. He also had dirt on just about everyone in power, and you want me to believe he took his own life? I'm not that mentally deficient. That's just not going to work. That's not a conspiracy theory, that's just a conspiracy. Now, I could continue this rant for hours on why Epstein clearly is not dead. There are facts upon facts upon facts that we could look into, but I think there's something even more compelling than that. Let's just take a look at everyone who had a chance of breaking this case open or might have had any amount of evidence on Epstein and what's happened to them since Epstein passed away. Because it seems a little too convenient for my taste. Take Virginia Giuffre, for instance, who was living in Australia with her family at the time at their ranch when she got into a car accident and was given 4 days to live, according to a post she made to social media. Shortly thereafter, though, she seemed to recover and was fine again, which is a little odd. Her family then made the effort to go online and say that Virginia was just not in her right mind after the accident. Yet according to Australian police reports, there were no injuries reported from this car accident. At the same time, we're getting news that her husband was abusive, yet we also know that her husband had claimed that Virginia was abusive, and they had both been in court over this. Once again, though, we have no actual proof that anyone was abusive in the relationship, because I can't even really find many of Virginia's posts on the topic. Continuing on with that, Virginia in April of 2025 is found dead by suicide, which is odd, and I don't believe that, period. But I especially don't believe it because Virginia made a post to social media discussing how if she's ever found dead by suicide, it wasn't of her own volition and that she did not commit suicide. She was murdered. Continuing even further down that rabbit hole, there is a note that she left that her family said was a suicide note, except we've only gotten a very tiny part of that note, and it reads as follows. Mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers need to show the battle lines are drawn and stand together to fight for the future of victims. Is protesting the answer? I don't know, but we've got to start somewhere. They kind of tried to phrase this as a suicide note, or like something was going on with Virginia and she took her life over this, but this is clearly not a suicide note. It's saying that you want to continue the fight, which she obviously did by putting on blast Epstein and Ghislaine and everything that they had done. And looking at the letter itself, you can see that there are bullet points, meaning that these were just a few of many points she had listed out for us to know, yet only this small section has ever been released to my knowledge. So very odd and too much mystery surrounding her death for me to believe it's just a suicide. Continuing on, we have Mark Middleton, who served as a special assistant to President Bill Clinton during the first term of his presidency. Mark Middleton had admitted Epstein into the White House at least 7 of his 17 times visiting during that first term, meaning Mark had access and knowledge of everything that went down between the two, and yet Mark dies by suicide in May of 2022. He was 59 years old and his body was found in a car at the Heifer Ranch, which is owned by an anti-poverty nonprofit in Arkansas, an hour west of Little Rock. Middleton was also known to have flown on Epstein's jet several times, the Lolita Express. Middleton was forced out of the White House in 1995 after being accused of setting himself up as an international deal maker. In 1996, there was an investigation by the White House which found Middleton had abused his access to impress business clients, and he was barred from the executive mansion without senior approval. And then we have Jean-Luc Brunel, Jeffrey Epstein's French modeling attaché, friend, whatever you want to call him. Jean-Luc was found dead in his Paris prison cell in February of 2020, where he had been since December of 2020 on charges of raping children. Brunel, much like Epstein, was allegedly caught multiple times after having tried to take his own life, but was not successful until February 19th of 2022, when guards entered his cell to find him hanging, and I can't make this up, via bed sheets from the top shelf of his bunk. And I imagine it was darn near identical to how Epstein had met his end as well. I think the similarities to how Epstein met his end in this case speak for themselves. Naturally, French investigators researched the topic and came to the conclusion that there was definitely no connection to Epstein, and Brunel took his own life. Virginia Giuffre said that Brunel had used her as a sex slave and forced her to have sex with well-known politicians and businessmen. And if this doesn't make you sick, Brunel's lawyers state that he was not guided by guilt, but by a profound sense of injustice, meaning that he was the one that was being done injustice after raping kids, and that he was innocent on all charges. Thomas Bowers, a former Deutsche Bank executive, hanged himself at his Malibu home in November 2019 at the age of 55. Bowers was the head of the Deutsche Bank's wealth management division until 2015. Deutsche's relationship with Epstein, which lasted for 5 years from 2013 to 2018, was the focus of many of the lawsuits after his death. In 2020, Deutsche Bank agreed to pay over $150 million to New York regulators to settle allegations that they had overlooked suspicious transactions linked to Epstein. Now, I'm going to add a little color here. They did not overlook. It is well known that Deutsche Bank knew exactly what this money was being traded for. And I think that this fellow's life, allegedly having been taken in his own hand, is even further evidence that Deutsche Bank and many of the people who worked there knew what Epstein was doing well in advance of it becoming mainstream media. And they absolutely could have stopped it or slowed it down, but chose not to. Deutsche Bank made a statement that says, "We acknowledge our error in onboarding Epstein in 2013 and the weaknesses in our processes, and have learned from our mistakes and shortcomings," a Deutsche Bank spokesman said at that time. The bank has also reached a $75 million settlement with victims of Epstein in 2023. They did not acknowledge any wrongdoing, though, as part of the settlement, and it does continue to get worse. Bowers had 3 children who are not only fatherless, but also motherless after she randomly and mysteriously perished in April of 2017. Now, I feel as though we can fill in what the random might have been in that, and that is not so mysterious, considering that Epstein and co. would have ensured that anyone who wanted to talk about what was going on would have been silenced. And I also imagine that Bowers might have tried to come out with this too, racked with guilt over the death of his wife, and he too had himself hanged. You know what? I'm a little angry about all of this, that he's gotten away with it, so let's continue down this list of all the other people who are linked to Epstein and his money, or knew him very well personally, who are now dead, allegedly by their own hand. Stephen Hoffenberger, Epstein's mentor, who served 18 years in prison for running a massive Ponzi scheme that stole over $500 million worth of people's money, had a huge conversion to Christianity during his time in prison, God bless. And following his release, he claimed to be seeking amends with all the victims of Epstein. And he was the guy who would have known more about Epstein than possibly anybody, having trained him in his methods for scamming people, although he, as far as we're aware, was not involved in the child trafficking process. Hoffenberger was serious about this, and he began reaching out to victims of Epstein and was trying to make amends with them seriously as hard as he could, including giving money and helping them get back on their feet. One such woman was Maria Farmer, who reported that she and Hoffenberg had become friends, of all things. Intriguingly though, Hoffenberger was found dead at his apartment in Derby, Connecticut on August the 23rd of 2022 at the age of 77. And of all people, Maria Farmer was the one who called in to the police to check on Hoffenberger after she couldn't get on the phone with him for the week before. In many ways, it's sweet that he was able to make a positive impact on these women's lives, but it does not change the fact that his body was in an advanced state of decomposition, according to the police, and it was estimated that he'd been dead for about a week at that point. In addition to Virginia Giuffre, there were 2 other sex slaves of Epstein's named Carolyn Andriano, who was 36 years old, and Leigh Skye Patrick, who was 29, and they both died of alleged drug overdoses, one in May of 2023 and the other also in May of 2017. And once again, here we go, Epstein's ex-butler, Alfredo Rodriguez, who is the reason we have Epstein's black book, because he sold it to an undercover FBI agent after stealing it, died in prison of mesothelioma, allegedly. Seems like a fat chance of that happening. In addition to this, 2 of Epstein's attorneys have passed away. One was Kenneth Starr in September of 2022 at the age of 76 due to a surgical complication, and a man named Roy Black, who died at the age of 80 just last month. Joe Riccari, the Palm Beach police detective who led the Epstein investigation initially and pushed officials for justice hard, died May 25th of 2018 after a very short illness. He was 50. Marvin Minsky, the MIT artificial intelligence pioneer and named in Virginia Giuffre's Epstein allegations, suffered a fatal cerebral hemorrhage in January of 2016 at the age of 88, while Ronald R. Eppinger Sr., who was a Miami pimp, was allegedly the first to traffic Giuffre, died at the age of 80 in November of 2006. 2 investigative journalists who had been chasing Epstein in the scandal also met their end. Former NYPD detective and Epstein book author named John Connolly passed away in January of 2022 at the age of 78. Additionally, in May of 2016, seems like a lot of these happened in May, celebrity photographer Wendy Lay had her body discovered by the police under her London balcony, and police have still referred to it as a suicide, although I'm not quite sure how that could happen. At the time of her demise, she was 65 years old. Steve Bing, 55-year-old movie producer, fell from the 27th floor of his LA apartment building in June of 2020. Guess the conversation he just had with the FBI. You'd be correct, he had just been speaking to the FBI about Jeffrey Epstein and what he was up to. Bill Richardson, another New Mexico governor friend of Epstein's, died in his sleep in September of 2023, the age of 75. Many of these deaths may be newer within the past decade, but it goes a lot further back than that, and I'm sure we could find even more evidence. We all know that Les Wexner hired Epstein on to manage everything for him, financially speaking, which is not suspicious whatsoever, but you might not know that even before that, there was someone else who had been in a similar position to Epstein, that was in charge of managing a lot of Wexner's assets, but also in charge of some of his business operations. In March of 1985, this man was gunned down shortly after being questioned by the IRS about illegal tax shelters, which is very interesting considering that Epstein's job was allegedly at Bear Stearns to be the guy who would help the ultra-wealthy pay as little taxes as possible. And now, as we sit today, the most important accomplice to Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, sits behind bars in prison. And I just want you to think, based on the track record, what's probably going to happen to her is a suicide of some kind. Now, whether or not that's staged is up to you, but I do think that without a doubt, we have most certainly proven that Epstein did not take his own life. Epstein is certainly alive, and that Epstein is a threat to anyone and everyone who was around him. And that's why the ultra-powerful, wealthy, and the celebrities have maintained silence on the topic. And to this day, the media continues to push the narrative that Epstein did die in that prison cell, and that we should not look any further. That being said, thank you guys so much for watching. I did say I'd give you my theories about where he is, but I kind of did that in the video. I think it's obvious he's either in Israel or right back in his normal properties, just under a different name, possibly some cosmetic surgery, which has happened before for powerful people. Restarting whatever he was doing before, whatever you want to believe. According to our government, though, he wasn't doing anything. He was working alone, so he was just a weirdo, right? I love life. I'm really grateful for all the support you guys are giving on the channel. Don't like to walk near the edges of buildings. I don't keep any power cord in the house. I know how to swim. My heart is in good condition. If I disappear, I didn't just walk into the woods one day and decide to leave. And if you guys don't hear from me for a week, well, then something really bad has happened. Once again, guys, I really appreciate everything you're doing. Thank you so much. It means the world. The channel's growing like crazy. It's so much fun hanging out with you guys, streaming. Hope you guys liked this video. I know it was a lot, but I think it's something that needed to happen. Someone's got to talk about it, guys. This doesn't make any sense. Like, this doesn't make any sense that we're letting this happen at this point. So hopefully we can change it. I do really feel bad for all the victims, and I really hope this can bring some more information to light for you guys. It's gonna be my last Epstein video, unless this gets like 500,000 views in the first week. I'm never talking about him again. I'm so tired. But we're on to really cool stuff after this. So thank you guys again. To each and every one of you, it means the world. A special shout out to all the Patreon supporters on screen right now, and to Paul, the Prince of Patreon. He carries over there. He's a huge supporter of the channel. So thank you to Paul. But yeah, thank you to every one of you guys for watching, liking, subscribing, following the Instagram, playing on the Minecraft server. I see you guys over there. And yeah, that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. I can't wait to see each and every one of you in the next one.